Hello, my name is Elena Wüllhorst and I'm presenting the paper A Systematic Review of Regulatory Strategies and Transparency Mandates in AI Regulation in Europe, the US and Canada. This paper is submission number 171 for the Data for Policy Conference 2024. I am a graduate student at King's College London and work together with Dr. Mona Sloane, who is an assistant professor of Data Science and Media Studies at the University of Virginia. Let's look at the agenda for this talk. I begin by introducing the goal of the paper and discussing its methods. Then I present our findings, in particular the patterns in regulatory strategies and transparency mandates in AI regulations we identified. I conclude with reference to future work. Evidence has been mounting that AI systems can cause harms and amplify already existing systems of discrimination and oppression. These include limiting access to resources and opportunities, as well as over-surveillance and wrongful accusation of criminal behavior. In 2023, this development was accelerated by the release of generative AI systems, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Bard, or Anthropic's Claude. AI safety has become a central concern. In response, policymakers and governments, as well as industry players, are increasingly under pressure to devise regulations and governance measures that mitigate potential AI harm. More AI regulations are created and envision guardrails to address potential AI harms. AI regulation has also become a geopolitical concern. While the quote-unquote race for AI regulation has been interpreted as fruitful for identifying best policies and regulatory tools, there is also an absence in global harmonization. However, importantly in these debates, the AI regulations and policies at the state and local level are often forgotten. On the other side, there's the applied AI work on fair, accountable, and transparent AI, putting guardrails into place. The cornerstone of safe and equitable AI systems is considered to be AI transparency. AI transparency is not only a legal and regulatory concern, but also a technical and therefore a socio-technical concern. The research on applied methods for opening up AI's black box and developing fair, accountable, and transparent machine learning techniques has rapidly grown over the past 5 years. This field, however, is not necessarily informed by a close reading of the ongoing AI regulation discourse. This disconnect between applied research on fair, accountable, and transparent AI and the ways in which the AI policy discourse frames and treats the same issues means that synergies are forgone. This is the context of our paper. We want to address the disconnect just mentioned between AI policy and applied AI research on compliance, and identify patterns in regulatory strategies and transparency mandates to create the synergies. We are interested in the ways in which AI regulation is strategically approached and how AI transparency is framed within AI regulation. We survey the landscape of proposed and enacted AI regulations in Europe, the US, and Canada, geographies that have both growing AI industries and demonstrate high AI regulatory activity. We provide a qualitative analysis of regulatory strategies and patterns in AI transparency. Our work is driven by the following research questions. What are the regulatory strategies in existing AI regulations in Europe, the US, and Canada? And what are the patterns of AI transparency measures in existing AI regulation in Europe, the US, and Canada? To respond to these research questions, we collected and analyzed AI regulations. The data collection took place in 2 phases. We started collecting regulations in the summer of 2022 and had a second data collection phase in fall 2023. Our data collection focused on AI regulation in the European Union and European countries, in the US and in Canada, across levels of government, so on the local, state, national, and transnational level. To be included in the sample, AI regulations had to be either enacted or not enacted. So the sample includes inactive regulations and those that have failed the regulatory process. This study is an examination of aspirations of AI regulations as well as of the AI regulations that are in effect. To be included, and following our focus on transparency, regulations had to explicitly address either the functioning or the operation of AI systems. So we exclude regulations establishing committees or councils on AI and regulations mentioning AI but not explicitly addressing it, such as data privacy regulations and fiscal laws, for example. 2 exceptions were made. The 2022 US Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and the US Executive Orders. These were added because of their signaling effect. The final dataset consists of 129 AI regulations. All regulations in the sample were proposed or enacted in the timeframe from July 2016 to October 2023. There are different regulatory formats in the sample, such as directives, amendments, acts, bills, municipal codes, ordinances, administrative codes, and moratoria. The regulations are distributed across levels of government. 22% of our regulations are on the local level, 53% are on the state level, 23% are on the national level, and 2% on the transnational level. The dataset is heavily skewed towards US regulations, with around 90% of all regulations in the dataset being from the US. Only 8% are European and 2% Canadian regulations. In the figure on the right, we can see the regulatory initiatives in the US on the subnational level. Many states, highlighted in green, have at least one enacted regulation. Yellow states indicate that at least one AI regulation has been proposed. The green pins indicate enacted local regulations. We can see here a clustering of local regulations in Massachusetts and also California, where there are 7 local regulations enacted alone in the Bay Area. The regulations on the local level often share content, in that they use similar formulations and specify requirements often verbatim. The full dataset with the names, codes, geographies, and affected populations, amongst other things, is an appendix to our paper. It is openly accessible. For the data analysis, we followed a qualitative coding approach. We used both descriptive and evaluative codes for this. We read each regulation and wrote a summary paragraph of it and of the transparency requirements, building up the database. We used a combination of the codes to analyze how AI transparency was framed and articulated in the regulations. During the coding process, patterns began to emerge immediately for both the regulatory strategies and the transparency mandates. We discussed these patterns and consolidated codes based on their growing overlap in meaning. Of course, this study shows a number of limitations. We have biases that limit our ability to make generalizable statements. Our dataset is characterized by a Western-centric view, excluding regulatory developments in other geographies, such as geographies with very important AI and software industries in China or India, and those historically excluded from global technology discourses, such as African countries. Also, as already mentioned, the dataset is heavily skewed towards US regulations. It must also be noted that 55% of all the regulations in the dataset are not enacted yet or are inactive. Moreover, the focus on AI regulation limits what can be said about the political and social processes surrounding AI lawmaking. In other words, this research cannot and does not address issues of inequality in AI regulations. Further, although we are working towards creating synergies between AI policy and applied AI work, including on compliance, this study does not include research on compliance practice or the careers of AI regulations over time. So now let's consider the findings of our data analysis. We identified 3 types of dominant regulatory strategies that cut across AI regulations in Europe, the US, and Canada, as well as 6 AI transparency patterns. We start by looking at the regulatory strategies. The 3 types of regulatory strategies we identified are overhauls, novel AI regulations, and the omnibus approach. In our sample, 42% are overhauls, 50% are novel AI regulations, and 8% are omnibus regulations. The first regulatory strategy that emerges at the intersection of AI and lawmaking is the overhaul of existing legal frameworks with a focus on AI. The driving question here is, how can existing regulatory frameworks be leveraged to account for AI-specific risks and impacts and mitigate those? A notable example of an AI-focused overhaul are adjustments made to US anti-discrimination legislation. For example, the proposed supplement to the 1945 New Jersey law against discrimination seeks to modify existing anti-discrimination legislation to account for discrimination that can occur in the use of automated decision systems or AI. The second dominant regulatory strategy for AI are novel regulations that are exclusively focused on AI. These come at different scales and levels, but are always new laws created within a given legal regime. Within this type of strategy, a pattern emerges. Novel AI regulations tend to focus on the artifact of AI, so a specific type of AI technology or a specific application, or they set out to enhance AI literacy and skills. Novel AI regulation designed to enhance AI literacy and skills are, for example, regulations mandating skills assessment and the enhancement of specific segments of the workforce. An example of this is the proposed 2022 New Jersey Act requiring the Commissioner of Labor and Workforce Development to conduct a study and issue a report on the impact of artificial intelligence as it pertains to the growth of the state's economy. The third category are omnibus regulations. Regardless of the domain, an omnibus regulation is generally large in scope, not constrained to a specific sector, and may contain more than one substantive matter. Omnibus regulations are rare and typically take a long time to develop and get passed. An example is the EU AI Act, which deploys a risk-based approach. The risk-based approach involves tailoring requirements to the specific risks associated with the use of an AI technology. For example, the AI Act imposes restrictive ex ante and ex post testing and mitigation approaches, chiefly pre-market deployment impact assessments and post-market deployment audits. Next, let's consider the prevalence of regulatory strategies. This figure shows the regulatory strategies across levels of government or AI localism level. It can be observed that on the state and local level, regulations are generally novel AI regulations or overhauls. Omnibus regulations are typically proposed at the transnational or national level. This figure shows the prevalence of regulatory strategies across geographies. European and Canadian regulations focus on the omnibus approach, whereas in the US, many overhauls and novel AI regulations are proposed. Even though omnibus regulations present a minority in the sample, they generally affect more people than novel AI regulations or overhauls. In Europe, very early on, AI regulations was considered a matter of the EU rather than national legislation. The EU began working on the topic as early as 2017, and this development effectively halted AI regulations on the national level of EU member states. This figure also shows the skew in our sample towards US regulations, as mentioned in the limitations. Now let's turn to our second findings, the patterns in AI transparency mandates. The AI transparency mandates identified in the sample fall into 6 categories. They are human in the loop, assessment, audits, disclosures, inventories, and red teaming. The pie chart shows the distribution of the individual transparency mandates in the sample. 8% of all transparency mandates assigned are human-in-the-loop requirements mandating human oversights. 35% are assessments evaluating systemic risks. 27% of the transparency mandates in the regulations considered are disclosures, which require a clear, conspicuous notice in plain language that an AI system is in use. 16% of the mandates are audits, which can be understood as an ex post assessment. And 13% are inventories, which give an overview of the use cases of a specific technology and can include training data and information on the functioning and liability of the system. Red teaming is the smallest category with 1%. It is a novel method used to test an AI system's vulnerabilities. Next, I will look at each category again in more detail and give an example regulation. Now let's consider examples and start with the human-in-the-loop requirements. Many regulations treat human intervention as a pathway to mitigating potential AI harms. This usually requires at least a partial opening up of AI's black box because the system has to be designed in a way such that a human can actually intervene. An example regulation is the IT deployment law enacted in April 2022 in the German state of Schleswig-Holstein. It governs the use of data-driven information technologies by public entities. A human must replace the technology in cases of technical failure at the request of the affected person or if the system fails to produce a result. Next, assessments. Assessments are techniques designed to evaluate systemic risks and impacts of AI. They are typically articulated in terms of civil rights and liberties, privacy, and discrimination. Assessments can be mandated both ex ante or ex post. An example regulation is the Canadian Directive on Automated Decision Making. It requires the use of an algorithmic impact assessment tool. The tool is designed as a questionnaire to help assess the impact level of an automated decision-making system based on factors such as the system's architecture and the nature of decision it makes. Next, audits. Audits are prominent in many AI regulations and can be considered an ex post assessment. Audits generally compare how an AI should behave versus how it actually behaves. An example is the New York City's Local Law 144 concerned with automated employment decisions tools. It mandates an annual bias audit. Even though the term bias audit is not defined, it is widely interpreted in the context of US anti-discrimination legislation in employment. Next, let's look at the second half of the transparency mandates. Disclosure requirements typically prescribe that AI users must be notified that an AI system is at work. Some AI regulations require disclosure for bots, advertisements, or content moderation. An example is the amendment of the California Business and Professions Code relating to bots, enacted in 2018. Bots are defined as online accounts whose actions and posts are not produced by a person. When bots are used to communicate or interact in commercial transaction or in an election, then this must be disclosed in a clear, conspicuous, and reasonably designed format. Next, inventories. Inventories are designed to provide an overview of the uses of AI by specific organizations or agencies. Their format varies. Inventories are not always public, and nor are they necessarily comprehensive. An example is the regulation HP 1174 in the US state of Maine, which is concerned with face surveillance. It prohibits government officials from using face surveillance systems and their data except for purposes such as the investigation of a crime. Requests to search facial surveillance system must be logged, and these logs are public records and must contain, for example, the race and sex of the person under investigation. Finally, red teaming. Red teaming is a relatively novel addition to the canon of AI transparency pattern. It originates from military simulations in the Cold War, and red teaming has since been employed as a tactic in cybersecurity to identify and hence address flaws in the system. In the context of AI, the 2023 President Biden executive order includes AI red teaming as a key measure. Now let's look at the combination of transparency mandates. First, overall, 48 out of the 129 regulations analyzed do not assign any transparency mandate. For single mandates, we can see the diagonal entries of the heat map figure. For example, 55 regulations require some form of assessment and 42 some form of disclosure. But many regulations require a combination of measures. In total, 46 regulations have two or more transparency mandates. These can be seen in the off-diagonal entries of the figure. For example, 24 regulations require assessments alongside disclosures. This heat map is symmetric along the diagonal and follows a temperature scale. Finally, we want to note that the transparency mandates we identified in our dataset should not be taken as comprehensive nor as best practice. We want to caution against using the list of AI transparency mandates in a checkbox manner. Rather, we envision a future of applied socio-technical research where researchers can build on these patterns to push forward with applied research on any of these mandates. To conclude, in this paper, we provided a bottom-up analysis of 129 AI regulations in Europe, the US, and Canada across levels of government. We identified patterns in regulation strategies and AI transparency mandates. The goal of the study was to begin building a bridge between the AI policy world and applied socio-technical research on fairness, accountability, and transparency in AI. We hope that future work will shed light on the AI regulations that were not included in the study, particularly in geographies that tend to be underrepresented in AI research. Moreover, future research can turn to ethnographic exploration of the AI lawmaking process in order to generate a better understanding of how the typologies we identify in this paper come about. Lastly, we envision that future work will examine how participatory policymaking and participatory compliance processes can be established. Thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to contact Dr. Mona Sloane as the corresponding author with questions. Thank you.